Hi, it's Katrina.
Dunatar Castle. Dunatar Castle sits perched on the edge of a great sea cliff overlooking the endless blue ocean. It is one of the most dramatic and romantic ancient castles in Scotland. It truly looks like somewhere straight out of a fairy tale. This place was once a mighty medieval fortress, the location for some of the most noteworthy events in British history. The castle has been burned, torn down, rebuilt, and then burned again. Armies have laid siege to the castle. It's been the home of queens and saints, and today it's nothing but a magical ruin. Nobody knows when people first arrived and lived on the rocky outcrop where the fortification now stands. Some historians say it may have been a prehistoric settlement going back over 2,000 years. What we know for sure is that the earliest historical record is of a church on the Rock of Dunatar in the 5th century AD. The church was established by Saint Ninian as one of the first Christian sites in northern Scotland. Then, over the years, the church transformed. It became a fort, a settlement, and then, finally, a castle. In the 9th century, King Donald II tried to use the castle to defend against a surprise Viking attack. The defense was a huge failure, and the Vikings struck the king down right there in his own home. The most famous occupier of the castle was William Wallace. Wallace was a total savage in the 13th century. He captured the castle and burned alive the English refugees who took shelter in the church. These surviving buildings are largely from the 15th and 16th centuries. You can visit the magical remains for yourself, and it's one of Scotland's most iconic locations. The castle has inspired many backgrounds for films, including Hamlet from 1990 and my personal favorite animated movie, Disney Pixar's Brave. Have you ever been here before? This place is definitely on my bucket list. The Pantheon. It's hard to find somewhere more legendary in Rome than the Pantheon. Sure, the Colosseum is impressive, but the Pantheon is something else entirely. This monument is the physical representation of Rome's glory and has been for 2,000 years. It was built by Emperor Agrippa around 25 BC. Initially, the Great Temple was dedicated to the 12 major gods of Rome. The building that still stands was likely a reconstruction of the original Pantheon, commissioned by Emperor Hadrian between 118 and 125 AD. The building technique used in the construction is quite extraordinary. It's one of the few ancient Roman buildings that's remained perfectly stable and almost fully intact. As with many Roman constructs, the purpose behind the Pantheon changed as the years went by. What was originally a temple to the pagan gods soon became a piece of Christian history. In 608, Pope Boniface IV had the corpses of martyrs removed from their original resting places in the Christian catacombs and put in the Pantheon. From that moment onward, the temple was officially a Christian building. Its name was changed to Saint Maria and Martyrs. The Pantheon is still being used as a place of Christian worship today, but if you look deep within the roots of the building, you'll see it was once a legendary temple, a place where early Romans came to give praise to the 12 gods. It's shout-out time! I want to say a big thank you to Chiswack and the Youngblood46 for supporting this channel. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos about amazing legendary places. Castle Sant'Angelo. The Castle Sant'Angelo, also known as the Mausoleum of Hadrian, is a massive historic building in a park in Rome. East of the Vatican in Parco Adriano is the building commissioned by Roman Emperor Hadrian to be his final resting place. It should come as no surprise to anyone that Roman emperors were often narcissistic. Every single one of them wanted a grand monument to be remembered by, and it worked. While most of them tried to complete at least one major building project to make their name immortal, Hadrian succeeded spectacularly. He was behind the Hadrian Wall, and his mausoleum is one of the most impressive buildings in Rome today. Just like the legendary Pantheon, the mausoleum went through changes. It was built between 134 and 139 AD, and that was when it looked its best. Legend has it the mausoleum was topped with a lush garden like a hanging jungle. Hadrian's ashes were placed within his tomb in 138. So too were the ashes of his wife Sabina and their adopted son Lucius. But here's where everything started going wrong for Emperor Hadrian. He had expected the tomb to be used only for the remains of himself and his immediate family members. But these succeeding emperors were also buried in his tomb. The last recorded burial was Emperor Caracalla in 217. Nearly a century of dead Roman rulers had their ashes put in urns and then stored in a treasury room deep in the mausoleum. Then things changed again. The mausoleum was transformed into a military fortress in 401. The Visigoths, who looted Rome in 410, scattered the ashes of all those who were buried inside. Hadrian had his ashy remains thrown around the pillaged streets of Rome. The whole place was smashed, burned, and all its statues and decorations destroyed. But the building wasn't finished yet. Its bones were still good and strong. In the following years, the structure was turned into a castle, and in the 14th century, Pope Nicholas III connected the castle to St. Peter's Basilica using a secret underground passage, now called the Passetto di Borgo, St. Brendan's Island. St. Brendan's Island is a legendary island believed to be located somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, somewhere near northern Africa. Legend goes that the island was discovered by St. Brendan in the year 512. St. Brendan traveled across the ocean with 14 monks, stumbled upon an uninhabited piece of land, and they stayed there for 15 days. According to the legend, the party was only there for 2 weeks, but the ships waiting for their return said they were gone for a full year. The whole time, the island remained shrouded in a thick haze of fog and couldn't be reached by anyone else. The island became a kind of marine ghost story, and even today, nobody knows if it truly exists. Later on in the Middle Ages, a monk by the name of Barino claimed he too discovered the mysterious island paradise shrouded in fog. The island was covered in thick woods. The sun never set, and the trees were ripe with fruit. The birds sang and the rivers flowed, and it was a land of abundance and peace. The King of Portugal became interested in the island in the 15th century. Famous explorer Henry the Navigator allegedly came across the island but couldn't reach it because of dangerous sea conditions. When he tried to find it again, the island had simply vanished. Even Christopher Columbus believed in the existence of St. Brendan's Island. It was included in maps until very recently, but in modern times, no sea captain has ever laid eyes on it. Mount Penglai. Mount Penglai is a legendary place from Chinese and Japanese mythology, but no one can say with any certainty if the place truly exists. Ancient Chinese texts describe the mountain as being situated at the eastern part of the Bohai Sea. In mythology, prior to the Qin dynasty, it was said Mount Penglai contains the secrets for the elixir of life. The mountain was home to the immortals, very similar to Mount Olympus in Greece. Chinese myth says the immortals lived in a massive palace at the top of the mountain, a palace made from gold and silver with trees sprouting jewels. There have been various theories offered as to the true location of Mount Penglai, but nobody's ever been able to decide on one. Some say it's in Japan, some say Korea, others say Taiwan. Nobody knows the truth. But historians are fairly certain the mountain from legend was based on a real mountain somewhere in Asia. Emperor Qin Shi Huang, founder of the Qin dynasty and unifier of China, even went in search of the mountain. At some point during his rule between 221 and 210 BC, he went on a journey to find Mount Penglai and obtain the secret to immortality. He never found it and never became immortal. However, one of his servants supposedly discovered Mount Fuji in Japan and mistook that for the mythical mountain. Misty Peaks of the Azores. 800 miles west of Portugal are the Azores Islands. For most people, the volcanic archipelago is an exotic paradise for partying and expensive vacations. However, these pristine islands could be the mountaintops from the famous sunken landmass we call Atlantis. Ocean explorer Thor Heyerdahl, along with Dr. Dominique Gorlitz from Oslo, recently came forward with some shocking information. They revealed that archaeologists discovered ruins of what appear to be pyramid-like structures on the islands that predate the original Portuguese settlements. These structures appear to be linked to similar mysterious buildings uncovered in North Africa, the Canary Islands, and Sicily. Another thing is that the Azores Islands chain is directly in front of the Pillars of Hercules. sitting in the exact position Plato claimed Atlantis was. We don't have a lot of physical proof to go off of right now, but there are a lot of coincidences that point to the magical lands of the Azores as being the ancient mountain tops of Atlantis. When Atlantis supposedly flooded about 12,000 years ago, it may have left only its mountains above sea level. It could be that at the bottom of the ocean, off the coast of the Azores, is the buried proof we need that Atlantis really did exist. Do you think this could be the location of the legendary Atlantis? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and while you're at it, be sure to subscribe. The City of the Round Pyramid. In the 14th century, a group of people known as the Purepecha emerged in central Mexico and started to bully the Aztec. As the powerful Aztec civilization expanded, the Purepecha pushed against them in the northwest. They were the second biggest force in Mexico before the Spanish arrived. For whatever reason, the Aztec were just unable to defeat them. The capital of the Purepecha people was a city called Tzintzuntzan, which translates to place of hummingbirds. The name kind of sounds like the buzz of a hummingbird's wings, right? After the fall of the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, in 1521, the Purepecha knew they were in trouble. They sent an emissary to the Spanish in hopes that they could avoid a similar fate, but they couldn't, or at least they made a big mistake. The Spanish arrived at the city in 1522 and were confronted by a massive army of 100,000 soldiers. However, the Purepecha didn't wish to fight. They instead submitted to the Spanish and agreed to pay tribute if the Spanish would just leave them alone. You may already know how this story ends. The Spanish government gradually beat down these people until, by the 1530s, they were nearly extinct. The capital was changed from Tzintzuntzan to Pátzcuaro. The native land was now the Spanish province of Michoacán, and soon the fabled city was abandoned. All the remains of Tzintzuntzan are a group of destroyed pyramids. These people had a knack for building tall, circular pyramids. They were unlike the pyramids built by other cultures of Mesoamerica, but now they are totally destroyed, in utter shambles, and very little research has been done to find out the truth about them. The city and its pyramids are almost forgotten, and yet only 500 years ago it was a city that could rival anything built by the Aztec or the Maya. The Agra Fort. The Agra Fort in India was once the seat of the Mughal emperors. The history of the fort is tied directly to other notable Mughal-era constructions like the Taj Mahal. It was built by Emperor Akbar in 1565 and served as the principal residence for all rulers until 1638. That was when the capital of the empire changed from Agra to Delhi, which is still the capital of India to this day. The very last Indian rulers who occupied the megalithic fortress were the Marathas. Then came the British. The British defeated the Marathas in 1803 in what was known as the Battle of Assaye, and took ownership of the fortified city. Then the Indian Rebellion of 1857 caused the British East India Company to lose control, which itself led to 100 years of authoritarian rule by Britain. Just like the Taj Mahal, which is the Agra Fort's sister monument, the fort is something out of a dream. It has tall red walls up to 70 feet high, yawning gates, and double ramparts to keep out invaders. Battlements, drawbridges, a moat, and everything else you would expect to find in a medieval fortress. It was more of a walled city than just a military fortification. The most striking feature is the red sandstone, which makes the fortress look all that more imposing. Corvin Castle. Corvin Castle is one of the most striking castles in Europe. It's also one of the biggest, with construction beginning in Romania in 1440. It was designed as a formidable defensive fortress to ward away the Ottoman invaders. It was also likely used briefly as a prison for the legendary Vlad the Impaler. When talking about Romanian castles, Corvin Castle is even more spectacular than Peles Castle and more mystically eerie than Bran Castle. Construction of the castle was ordered on behalf of John Hunyadi and his son, Matthias Corvinus. Matthias was the king of Hungary from 1458 to 1490, and their whole family had a huge impact on Europe that century. John Hunyadi was infamous for his brutal campaign in Belgrade. He was also related to Vlad the Impaler himself, the man behind the inspiration for Count Dracula. Corvin Castle is still in surprisingly good condition today. The Knight's Hall is still ready to hold a grand feast. The Diet Hall is waiting for its next ceremony. These circular stairways lead down to dungeons and up into tower rooms. The whole place is especially spooky at night, when the shadows come out and the forest falls quiet. Would you spend the night in this castle? Let me know in the comments. Baalbek. Baalbek is an ancient Phoenician city taken straight from a Mesopotamian legend. The remains of the fabled city can be found in modern Lebanon, not far from the city of Beirut. The history of Baalbek goes back at least 11,000 years. It's so unbelievably old that nobody knows the truth of its origins. Ancient people most certainly lived here at the dawn of civilization, but the exact details are foggy at best. When civilization truly got going with the rise of Mesopotamian kingdoms, Baalbek became a center of worship. This was an important pilgrimage site visited by people all over the ancient world. The city was particularly famous for its patron gods, Baal, the sky god, and his consort Astarte, queen of heaven. At the very center of the city was an unimaginably huge temple dedicated to both gods. It may have been one of the biggest temples ever built in the ancient world. But sadly, the temple was destroyed and the Romans built the Temple of Jupiter right over it.
Mohenjo-Daro. The city of Mohenjo-Daro, located in Pakistan, was once the capital of an extraordinary early civilization. The city was built at the dawn of civilized humanity, around the year 2500 BC. It grew to be the largest settlement of the Indus Valley civilization. This city beat out its contemporaries in ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, Crete, and on the other side of the world in South America. Its builders were some of the first people in history to create a city using a planned street grid. This was a major revolution in urban planning. Mohenjo-Daro was truly one of the first modern cities 4,500 years ago. The architects created an elaborate drainage system to help with waste disposal. They were able to control water to help with agriculture and keep their citizens healthy. Even more mysterious is that nowhere in Mohenjo-Daro have archaeologists discovered palaces, temples, or religious monuments. There appears to have been no religion here and no central seat of government for a ruler. There doesn't even appear to have been a ruling class. These people prospered without a king or queen and without a religion telling them what to do. Sadly, though, their civilization only lasted about 600 years. By the 19th century BC, Mohenjo-Daro was abandoned. We still don't know what happened. However, many researchers theorize that because they lacked a formal government and because they never went to war, another rising civilization violently wiped them off the map. The city was lost to the desert sands and only discovered in 1911. A few small excavations happened throughout the 1920s, but it wouldn't be until the 1960s that modern archaeologists truly started investigating the lost culture, discovering the Maya. John Lloyd Stevens and Frederick Catherwood were the two brave explorers behind the discovery of the ancient Maya. They didn't merely discover a lost city, they identified a lost people and brought attention to them on the world stage. John and Frederick traveled throughout Central America from 1839 to 1842, documenting their travels from one abandoned jungle metropolis to the next. They fought their way through hundreds of miles of inhospitable jungles. They suffered unimaginable humidity, sweltering heat, and rain that threatened to tear their skin off. They were thwarted by a civil war, hostile enemies, and wild animals. They even had to contend with malaria, flesh-eating parasites, and insect bites. They were the first English-speaking people to ever venture into many parts of Central America, and they themselves met real descendants of the Maya who still spoke their ancient language. This was really the golden age of exploration, when it was still possible to travel to uncharted lands. John and Frederick first discovered the Maya ruins of Copan in Belize, back then known as British Honduras. They then traveled through the jungle and documented the lost cities of Palenque, Quirigua, and Uxmal. By the time they finished, they had documented a total of 44 ancient Maya sites, many of which had never been seen by foreigners before. Helike. In the year 373 BC, there was a catastrophic earthquake that shook the lands around the Mediterranean Sea in Europe. At the time, the Greek city of Helike was positioned on the southwest shore of the Gulf of Corinth. The city was so close to the water that when the earthquake caused a tsunami to sweep over the city, the whole place was sucked into the ocean. The city slipped into the water, it was covered in silt, and completely vanished. Ancient Greek writers believed the people of Helike had somehow angered the god Poseidon, who retaliated by plunging their city into the sea. For a long time, no one truly knew if Helike existed, or if it was just another story like the fabled lost city of Atlantis. Professor Spyridon Marinatos believed the stories to be true. He believed that when the city was discovered, it would be even more impressive than the discovery of Pompeii in Italy. He was quoted as saying Helike would be the most spectacular archaeological discovery ever made. In 2001, researchers finally found something. Buried underneath the ancient deposits of an old lagoon, they found evidence of an early Bronze Age town from 2400 BC. But this was 2,000 years before the sinking of Helike, 20 centuries too early. It would be later that same year that Helike was finally found, confirmed by a layer of cobblestones, roof tiles, and pottery. The biggest shock wasn't the discovery of Helike itself, but the revelation that many cities on the same stretch of coast had been sucked into the ocean over the past 4,000 years. Hvalsey. Hvalsey is on an island near Greenland that's home to one of the best preserved ancient Norse ruins in the region. The ruin is known as the Eastern Settlement, or by its much longer and harder to pronounce name, Estiribidjo. It was put on the UNESCO World Heritage List in 2017. This was over 1,000 years after it was established by the uncle of Eric the Red, who was the one who discovered Greenland. He was called Eric the Red because he had red hair and a bushy red beard. It was his uncle who arrived at Greenland's southern tip, traveled to Hvalsey, and built a small Norse settlement in the 10th century. We don't know much about the place, only that it was a small farming community and an important trading hub for Norse merchants. Archaeologists discovered 2 stone great halls, about 14 ruined houses, and a shockingly well-preserved church house. The last documented event that occurred at the settlement was in 1408, when a wedding took place at the church. Nobody knows what happened in the years that followed. Over the next 2 centuries, the Norse settlements in Greenland slowly died. It wasn't until 1721 that an expedition led by the Danish missionary Hans Egede found the Norse colonies in Greenland abandoned. When Hans showed up to check on the colonies, he found their buildings destroyed and the people long gone. Big thank you to Francis Stephen Peralta and Courtney Johnson for supporting this channel. If you are new here, welcome, and be sure to hit that subscribe button for more videos about amazing discoveries. Tikal. The lost Maya city of Tikal was first discovered by the Spanish in 1696. Spanish friar Andrés de Avendano was fleeing hostile forces and trying to make his way to Mérida in Mexico when he and his group came upon a mysterious city in the jungle. In his chronicles, Andrés described a place of vaulted houses, whitewashed plaster walls, and all the fixings of a forgotten jungle metropolis. It wasn't until 1848 that the first official report on Tikal was made, when the Guatemalan government visited the ruins and spent 6 days there. Since then, there have been extensive studies on this ancient Maya city. Curious anthropologists camped in tents and lived among the ruins in the early part of the 20th century. In more modern times, archaeologists performed excavations and even scanned the nearby jungle with lasers to discover even more hidden cities. In its heyday, Tikal was home to about 60,000 people living in the Maya lowlands. This part of Guatemala was such a densely forested area that even today it's one of the largest tracts of rainforest in the world. People established their city here around 600 BC and prospered for just shy of 1,500 years. The city grew up and out with an estimated 30,000 commoners living in the rural surroundings and surviving off the jungle. But by the year 900, things went sour. The inhabitants abandoned Tikal in the chaos during the collapse of the Maya Empire. We still don't know what happened, although some scientists believe it was a drought that caused cities like Tikal to run out of food to feed its people. Without sufficient food, Tikal devolved into anarchy and violence. Sarai Batu. Sarai Batu was the capital of the Golden Horde that spread across northwestern Asia and Eastern Europe between the 13th and 14th centuries. The ruins of the city are closest to the modern city of Astrakhan in Russia. Back in the 13th century, when the city was founded by the Mongol ruler Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, it was truly massive. With a population of around 75,000, it was likely one of the largest cities in medieval Europe. Sarai Batu was also right in the center of the Mongols' vast empire, which stretched across almost all of Eastern Europe, Siberia, and into the Iranian territories as well. Historical accounts from travelers who visited the city in the 13th century show Sarai Batu described as one of the most beautiful in the world. It was overflowing with people. It included towering mosques and cathedrals and had colorful bazaars and bathhouses. And it was highly multicultural. People here were European, Persian, Egyptian, Greek, Asian, everything. By the 14th century, though, the Mongols were starting to lose their grip over the land. As this happened, the city was slowly abandoned. The Crimean Khanate sacked Sarai Batu at the end of the 14th century. And even though it was rebuilt, Ivan IV of Russia came to totally destroy it in 1556. The city was lost, yet never forgotten. In the second half of the 18th century, curious archaeologists began digging around for its ruins. By the early 19th century, Sarai Batu and other Mongol cities had been dug up and rediscovered. Tuga. Tuga was a small Carthaginian settlement in North Africa before becoming part of the Roman Empire. It was first settled in the Bronze Age by primitive humans and later conquered by Agathocles of Syracuse in the 4th century BC. It became a thriving Numidian town at the border between Carthage and Numidia, and later came under Carthage's ownership. But it didn't matter who owned it, because after Rome defeated Carthage in the final Punic War of 149 to 146 BC, Rome took control of Tuga. Romans sent their own people to rule over the few surviving Numidians and Carthaginians until it just kind of became part of Rome itself. By the 3rd century AD, Tuga had become its own unique town occupied by new Christians. It was fortified later by the Byzantines. Archaeologists have identified numerous buildings suggesting a rich and complex culture by the time the city was finally abandoned many centuries ago. It was complete with Roman temples, Egyptian-style structures with pyramid-shaped roofs, great amphitheaters, Roman baths, and private villas. Ebla. Not far from the city of Aleppo in Syria is the largely unknown Ebla. It was originally an important city-state starting around the late 3rd millennium BC. It was in Ebla where archaeologists uncovered one of the most important pieces of Mesopotamian history. They found 17,000 preserved cuneiform tablets, like an ancient library written in stone, from 2250 BC. They were written in ancient Sumerian and a previously unknown language called Eblite. These tablets help scientists to decode the language of the Sumerians and better understand their culture. It was around the time the tablets were created that Ebla reached its height. This city grew to be a major economic center and one of the first fully democratic places in the world. Kings were elected in this city, unlike most other places where they ruled through succession. At least that's how things worked until King Ibrahim wanted his son to rule so badly that he changed the laws and became a dictator. This led the city-state down a path that would see their demise around the year 2200 BC. The emerging Akkadian Empire destroyed Ebla, in part thanks to their weak leadership caused by the collapse of democracy. And although Ebla was later rebuilt, it was destroyed yet again by the Hittites. It was reduced to little more than a dusty desert village. Then it disappeared completely by around the year 700 AD. It wasn't rediscovered by modern archaeologists until 1964. Napata. Napata was a city built at the edge of the Nile River in North Africa. It was part of the ancient Kingdom of Kush. the southern neighbors of the ancient Egyptians who lived in what is now Sudan. The area used to be called Nubia. In the 16th century BC, Napata was the southernmost settlement in Egypt. It was the greatest distance south that the kingdom spread. But by 750 BC, the city was out of Egypt's grasp and belonged solely to the Kushites. This lasted until the city fell in 663 BC, and the new capital of the Kingdom of Kush was moved to Meroe. But because of its position straddling both worlds, Napata had a very special place in both Egyptian and Kushite society. It was considered a holy land, with the hill of Barkal regarded as the seat of the god Amun. There are still multiple temple ruins found around the base of the holy mountain, and even artifacts left behind by pharaohs such as Thutmose III and Amenhotep II. Even after Napata was lost to the Egyptians and the Kushites were pushed even farther south, it remained a place of religious importance. But that importance started to wane around 270 BC, and by the year 23 BC, the city was little more than a ruin, sacked multiple times by the Romans. The site was rediscovered in modern times, but has yet to be fully investigated. Lothal. Lothal was another fantastic city left behind by the Indus Valley civilization. It was one of their major trade centers specializing in the exportation of materials, specifically beads, gems, and other precious jewels. The city was built on the banks of the Saraswati River about 4,200 years ago. It was rediscovered in 1954, and excavations have since revealed some of the oldest features of any city on Earth. For example, archaeologists identified what might be the oldest dock in the world. It was connected to the city by an ancient watercourse that stretched all through the Indus Valley civilization cities to the Arabian Sea and to the edge of the Kutch Desert. There are only 2 docks that might be older by a few decades, both of which are in Egypt on the Red Sea. Another impressive aspect of the city was its water system. There are still ancient wells in almost perfect condition that were used by the people of Lothal to pull water out of the earth. The wells are dry now, but their shells still remain even after 4 millennia. Life in Babylon. Babylon was an ancient kingdom in Mesopotamia. From between 1792 and 1750 BC, the kingdom was ruled over by a king named Hammurabi. Archaeologists have discovered so many tablets and ancient texts that they've been able to put together a picture of what life was like in Babylon nearly 4,000 years ago. If you walked through Babylon during the rule of Hammurabi, you would be flanked on both sides by tall walls of mud brick and the occasional door. Each door passed to an open courtyard, to a kind of communal zone ringed by rooms and living spaces. These open courtyards provided light and air, and a place for people to socialize. For the ancient Babylonians, family was extremely important. These courtyards were also the locations of family burial plots. Right outside where people slept were buried bodies of their ancestors, going as far back as they could remember. Although, to be fair, that wouldn't have been more than a couple of generations. It was a patriarchal society. However, history professor Amanda Podany says that women in ancient Babylon had more rights than women in ancient Greece 1,000 years later. They could go to court by themselves, were allowed to own property, and were even allowed to be priests. That's something that women still can't do in Catholicism. And here's one more thing about family life in ancient Babylon. It was very rare for a couple to be divorced, or for a man to take a second wife. Marriage, thousands of years before the Christian God was ever invented, was considered a sacred thing in Babylonian society. The only excuse for taking a second wife was if the first wife couldn't bear a child. The drug habits of the Maya. One of the most unique aspects of the Maya kingdom was their affinity for hallucinogenic drugs. The Maya were obsessed with reaching a state of what can only be described as spatial disorientation. In other words, getting so intoxicated on psychedelics, they felt as though they were becoming one with nature and speaking with the gods. These substances are called entheogens and can be traced back to at least 2,000 years ago during the Olmec era. They were consumed regularly until the Spanish showed up and started pillaging in the 16th century. The Maya would hold ceremonies in underground caves. They viewed these caves as sacred access points to the underworld, and when high on hallucinogens, their visions were intensified underground. One of their favorite things to consume was called balche, a drink infused with bark from the legume trees and fermented to make it mildly alcoholic. So much balche would be consumed that those participating in the ceremonies would usually vomit, increasing the intensity of their visions. Then there were the enemas. The Maya may have been a great civilization with powerful cities, but they were also obsessed with reaching maximum levels of intoxication. To do this, they would sometimes create a makeshift syringe from a gourd and some clay and inject pure hallucinogenic liquids into their rear ends to intensify the effects. The Kingdom of the Cliffs. There are an estimated 10,000 man-made caves that can be found on the side of a cliff in the Himalayas, hidden far from the main roads and way out in the middle of nowhere. They were only recently discovered in Nepal, and the caverns remain one of the most mysterious archaeological wonders in the world. The kingdom that called this place home is mysterious, to say the least. We don't know their name or anything really about them. Archaeologists from the University of Cologne began exploring the caves in the 1990s and were shocked at just how difficult they were to reach. Even some of the best climbers could barely make it up the steep cliffs, leading experts to wonder how in the world the original inhabitants had even built them. Corey Richards, an adventure photographer who recently visited the remote caves, called it scary and dangerous. He said that just climbing to reach the caves was crazy, as it felt like the entire cliff was going to collapse at any second. The caves themselves are beyond bizarre. They were inhabited as far back as 1000 BC, and many of them were used as burial chambers. Families lived in the caves over the years, and by the 1400s, just 600 years ago, they were used as meditation chambers for religious zealots. Unfortunately, nobody knows who built them. There once was a mighty kingdom here, and archaeologists have found evidence of warring tribes battling for possession over the caves, yet barely any trace of the people remains. The women warriors of Dahomey. The African kingdom of Dahomey flourished as recently as the 17th century. The kingdom was exceptional for one main reason. They were protected by a woman-only military regiment of fierce warriors. The kingdom came alive in present-day Benin in the year 1600. They were a major regional power, with a king who had absolute control over everything, from societal issues to economics. They had access to the sea, which helped them beat all the other coastal kingdoms nearby, giving them unprecedented dominance. But here's where things get uncomfortable. From between 1720 and 1852, the Dahomey ruled the slave trade. Historians have estimated that the Dahomey kingdom sold hundreds of thousands of people from neighboring tribes to the British, French, Portuguese, and anyone else who had money. This African kingdom grew rich and powerful by selling their enemies in the transatlantic slave trade. And then there's the part about the women warriors. It's not quite as progressive as it may seem. The issue was that too many raids on neighboring communities killed too many of their men. They lost so many men in battles that there was no choice but for women to become warriors as well. This wasn't something they did willingly from the start. The kingdom only welcomed women warriors into their ranks when they no longer had enough men to fight. The Dahomey slave trade came to a halt in 1852, when the British government outlawed it. The kingdom came to an end soon after when the French showed up. The Dahomey tried to raid the French camps and take them as slaves, but it backfired. In 1894, the Dahomey were crushed by the French. Big thank you to Mother's Load and what's his name. Thanks so much for watching. If you are new here, welcome, and be sure to subscribe for more videos about amazing discoveries. Vortigern and the Saxons. In the 5th century, Vortigern was the ruler of Britain. No one knows what his real name was, as Vortigern was simply an old title that meant Supreme Lord or Great Chief. We only know that this individual ruled over Britain and was the one behind the invasion of the Saxons. This guy personally invited the Saxons to Britain as part of a failed attempt to stop the Picts from invading the south and taking over the region. The history of the Great Saxon Kingdom began with Vortigern. The historian Gildas wrote that the Supreme Lord invited the Saxons to Britain in the year 449. The Saxons showed up with a massive fleet of ships. They were welcomed with open arms and treated like the saviors of Britain. They were brought from Europe as a heathen force of barbarians whose strength would help to defend the native Britons. But to understand why this was done, we need to look at what was happening with Rome. The Roman invasion of Britain started 400 years earlier, but by the year 410, the Roman Empire was in shambles. By 449, Rome was in the midst of being destroyed and had taken every garrisoned troop from Britain to fight wars. Even though the Romans were the invaders 400 years earlier, they had become the only thing protecting Britain from outside invasion. This left them vulnerable, and so the Picts from Scotland began moving south into Roman Britain. Across the channel on the mainland were the Saxons, a Germanic tribe in Germany. They were brought to Britain, but instead of protecting the lands they were supposed to, they took them over. The Saxons defeated the Romano-Britons and formed the Kingdom of West Saxons. They were the ones who brought what is now the English language to England, and they thrived on the British Isles until the 10th century. They conquered the rest of England and created the Anglo-Saxon kingdom, the Aksumites. The Kingdom of Aksum was at one point the mightiest empire in Africa. Its power and influence stretched far beyond its borders in East Africa to reach as far as Israel. Its heart was the city of Aksum, founded in Ethiopia during the 1st century AD. The empire quickly became wealthy, the civilization expanded, and they became masters over African trading routes leading to the Roman Empire and stretching into India. The capital city of Aksum was a sparkling metropolis with an estimated peak population of around 20,000. It was from this city that the Christian religion spread to the rest of Africa. But what makes the Aksumite kingdom so mysterious is that nobody knows its origins. We know that humans lived in Ethiopia since well before the Stone Age, but there were never any civilizations here that we know about. According to National Geographic, the original Aksumites, the ancestors of Ethiopians, may have come from across the Red Sea, migrating from the Arabian Peninsula. Whatever the case, Aksum was undefeatable. This city was built on a plateau 2,000 meters above sea level. It was impossible to invade and was protected on 3 sides by countless miles of desert and mountain that would obliterate any army that tried to invade. They traded everything from rhino horns to frankincense. The legendary Queen of Sheba lived here, and it was the Aksumites who took the Ark of the Covenant from the Holy Land and supposedly brought it back to Ethiopia. The downfall of this mysterious kingdom came in the 7th century. They lost their hold on Arabia, and the rise of the Islamic kingdoms ultimately sealed their fate. They weren't defeated and taken over, but simply made irrelevant. The rise and fall of the Himyarite. In the southern part of Yemen, a mysterious people known as the Himyarite kingdom converted to Judaism at a time when Christianity was all the rage. The Himyarite had been living in Yemen since around 110 BC, but in the 4th century they started converting to Judaism, and by 425, a powerful Jewish kingdom had risen in the most unlikely of places. But as you can imagine, a kingdom ruled by the Jewish faith did not last long on the southern tip of Arabia. Its kings ruled for only a century until the Christian kingdom of Aksum destroyed them in 525. The Aksumites were already coming to an end, but just before their relevance was taken away, they gathered a massive force and crossed the Red Sea. They obliterated the Himyarite kingdom in one swift attack. Judaism in Yemen was wiped out overnight, and so were the Himyarites. Their descendants would rise up decades later and lead the South Arabian Muslim forces against the Arab Christian tribes in 638. The Lost Atlantis. The ancient kingdom of Cantrer Gwylod supposedly existed in Wales, specifically in Cardigan Bay. It was an island kingdom that flourished centuries ago, but was swallowed by the sea and has been lost ever since. There are a lot of different stories surrounding the Lost Kingdom, everything from failed dikes to an overflowing well. But the honest truth is that no one has ever been able to find irrefutable evidence that the kingdom ever existed. But there is still hope. A pair of researchers from Swansea University in Wales have been trying to find Cantre'r Gwylod using old medieval maps, folklore, field studies, and geological surveys. They are using all scientific means at their disposal to find it. One of the most interesting pieces of evidence comes from the Go map, which dates back to the 13th century. It's considered the oldest surviving map of the British Isles. And sure enough, there is a huge landmass in the south of Wales that isn't there anymore. 800 years ago, there was a whole lot more land. Going back even further to the days of Rome, famous cartographer Ptolemy created a map of the Welsh coastline showing that it went 8 miles deeper into the sea. This lost kingdom most likely did exist, but is currently under hundreds of feet of water. The Lanna Kingdom. There was a lot going on in Southeast Asia in the 13th century. There was the Mon Kingdom, the Hariphunchai, the Khmer Empire, and so many others. Thailand was ruled by individual kingdoms based in sprawling cities. It was not a unified nation as it is today, but much like ancient Japan or China, it was fractured into various warring empires. The Lanna Kingdom took shape in the later part of the 13th century in the northern regions of Thailand. They had their capital at the ancient city of Chiang Mai, a city still standing today. The kingdom itself lasted until 1884, when the Kingdom of Siam adopted it as a province. The region slowly evolved until becoming a state in Thailand in 1949. And although most people view it as just another part of Thailand these days, the Lanna Kingdom was an independent region with its own character and culture. First of all, the Lanna people came from China's Yunnan province. They were originally called the Tai Yuan and likely migrated into the region to escape the invasion of the Mongols in central China. As the Mongols were busy dismantling the Burmese kingdom of Bagan and terrorizing Europe, the Tai Yuan were starting their own kingdom in the isolated jungles of Thailand's north. And there, sheltered by the thick trees and dense wilderness, they prospered unscathed for centuries. Lydia. The kingdom of Lydia flourished for a very short time. Between the 7th and 6th centuries BC, it prospered in Asia Minor thanks to its natural resources and trading routes. Its greatest time was during the reign of Croesus, 560 to 546 BC. He and his great army conquered Greek cities near the coast, and they pushed the borders of the empire all the way to the outskirts of the Persian Empire. This proved to be a major mistake. Lydia, which geographically speaking was a major part of what is now Turkey, should not have messed with Persia. The Persian king Cyrus II smashed King Croesus in 546 and forced Lydia to become a Persian province. Then, when Alexander the Great came along, he defeated the Persian armies and absorbed Lydia in the 4th century. In 280 BC, Lydia was absorbed into the Seleucid Empire. What had, for a very brief moment in history, been a powerful kingdom became nothing more than a small piece of land, one that was absorbed by one mightier power and then the next.
Thamugadi. The Great Sahara Desert is responsible for swallowing the ancient Roman outpost of Thamugadi in North Africa. The city was originally founded around the year 100 AD, built in the province of Numidia, what we now call Algeria. Under orders from Roman Emperor Trajan, the city was constructed on a flat spot in the desert, surrounded on all sides by countless miles of sand dunes. What started as a small settlement at the fringe of the Roman Empire quickly grew to become a mighty city. By the 3rd century AD, it had a population of about 15,000. It wasn't as big as Rome, yet historians claimed it was one of the most beautiful and exotic places in the Roman Empire. It was a unique metropolis rising from the very sand of the desert, like something you might see in Disney's Aladdin. Thamugadi still has many of its most impressive architectural features. Although the city was lost in the desert and its ruins were forgotten, it hasn't completely decayed.
Walls of houses are still partially standing, and there's a gigantic ark that may have been built in commemoration of some ancient victory. There are even the remains of a library and over a dozen Roman bathhouses. This was a truly spectacular desert city, but it was destroyed shortly after it reached its peak. In 430 AD, tribes of invaders breached the city and slaughtered its people, and Thamugari never recovered. The Aqueduct of Constantinople. The Aqueduct of Constantinople was once the longest water channel built by human hands. It was an incredible feat of engineering that still baffles scientists to this day. It was just recently, in 2021, that researchers from Johann Gutenberg University in Germany decided to do a thorough investigation of the aqueduct, which once supplied the shining city of Constantinople with fresh water. The aqueduct, at its completion, was 265 miles long. At the time, Roman infrastructure was far ahead of every other civilization in the world. They had better roads, bigger harbors, deeper mines, and longer aqueducts. Their most groundbreaking achievement really was water management, bringing a supply of drinking and bathing water straight to its people, even if they lived far from the source. Researchers from the university say some cities in the Roman Empire had more fresh running water than their modern versions have today. That just proves how effective Roman infrastructure really was. When Roman Emperor Constantine the Great declared Constantinople the new capital in 324 AD, it was important to bring water to the city. But the springs were extremely far away. Then, as the city grew and expanded into the 5th century, the springs grew even further away than before. The Great Aqueduct continuously had to be extended until it reached its maximum length of almost 270 miles. It consisted of impressive masonry channels, hundreds of tons of stone and concrete, over 90 bridges, and even underground tunnels a mile long. The aqueduct was one of the greatest marvels of the Roman Empire, a shining example of how the ancient world really did look like it was straight out of a fairy tale. The medieval city of Vijayanagara. The medieval Indian city of Vijayanagara is hardly recognizable, as it's little more than a decrepit ruin, some blocks of stone scattered throughout a wasteland of natural rock hills. But in the 14th century AD, this city was the capital of the mighty Vijayanagara Empire. Much of the information we have about this mystical place comes from either ancient historians or recent archaeological discoveries. The Persian traveler Abdur Razak wrote in 1440 that the city was protected by 7 layers of fortifications standing before the main gates to the royal palace. Each layer of fortification protected a specific part of the city. The only way for an invading army to reach the palace was to fight through each defensive perimeter. Even Domingo Paes, the Portuguese traveler, wrote that the city was the best in the world around 1520 AD. At one point in time, Vijayanagara may have had upwards of 1 million residents. The explorer Robert Sewell wrote during the colonial occupation of India that in the 1800s, the city was still filled with countless shops and bazaars. Then, in 1646 AD, the Vijayanagara Empire was defeated by the Deccan Sultanates in the Battle of Talikota. This loss rapidly led to the collapse of one of the most impressive cities in the world. Even though the city remained occupied for another few centuries, it was effectively ruined. After the 1800s, it was only ever used by local merchants as an outdoor marketplace. Matsumoto Castle. Matsumoto Castle is without a doubt one of the most picturesque castles in Japan. This ancient place is straight out of a fairy tale from the Far East, built with snowy mountain peaks in the background and surrounded by cherry blossom trees. The castle should not be confused with Himeji Castle or Kumamoto Castle, although all 3 of them look incredibly similar. Matsumoto Castle is by far the most majestic of them all, built as the seat of the Matsumoto domain during the Edo period under the Tokugawa shogunate. It was completed in the 16th century, and to this day, its original wooden architecture remains. The stonework is all authentic, but its defenses have since been lost to time. The castle was built on a plain instead of at the top of a hill or in the middle of twisting rivers, so it would have had an extensive security system. There would have been huge moats, impassable walls, and enough soldiers to repel an attack. Although the main keep was finished in the 16th century, the original fortification was built long before that in the Eisho era by a local shugo, or military commander. It was a meager fort up until 1550, when it was seized by the Takeda clan, who built it into the castle it is today. But between then and now, the castle has seen multiple battles and conquests. From between 1613 and 1725, it was occupied by 6 different clans. The Temple of Hercules Victor. The oldest marble building still standing in the city of Rome is the Temple of Hercules Victor. The mysterious round temple is miraculously still intact after over 2,000 years, with its pillars still somehow upright and supporting the roof. It immediately catches the eye of any visitor because it really looks like something you would expect to see while walking through the city of Rome during the days of the Empire. Amazingly, it hasn't changed almost at all since it was built around the year 120 BC. The Colosseum might be a more impressive sight, but the Temple of Hercules is mostly in its original form, whereas the Colosseum is still largely destroyed. The Temple of Hercules also holds the title of being the second oldest complete building in the city made entirely of Greek marble. The biggest mystery is that we don't know who the temple was originally dedicated to. It was eventually dedicated to Hercules, the victor, but nobody knows when that happened. It's possible the temple was initially made for the worship of a different Greek deity, then later it was attributed to Hercules. After all, the temple did spend a brief amount of time as a church in 1132 AD. Committed to Saint Stephen. Then it was later dedicated to Saint Mary of the Sun. It's a great example of how a building can be reused and repurposed depending on the popular god or saint at the time. The Assassin's Castle. Lamsar Castle was a very real ancient fortification used by a group of professional assassins. The castle was occupied by the Fidai military group, also called the Hashashin. They were part of the Nizari Ismaili sect, established as a distinct branch of Shia Islam about 1,000 years ago. The group was made up of assassins specialized in murdering political figures, often in public. They were behind the murders of at least 3 major caliphs and 1 ruler of Jerusalem. They also killed multiple leaders in the Muslim and Christian communities. Their base of operation was Lamsar Castle. In its prime during the 12th century, the castle was magnificent. It was built in the center of the Alborz Mountains, overlooking deep, twisting valleys and the Caspian Sea on the horizon. But because the castle was so horribly destroyed by the Mongols around 1256 AD, it's difficult to imagine what exactly it once looked like. We can only picture a tall castle in the midst of sprawling, dusty mountains, each day filled with the clamor of assassins training for battle. Dhamma Sakyamuni Monastery. The Dhamma Sakyamuni Monastery is not a place many people have heard of before. It's one of the last remaining limestone cave temples in Malaysia occupied by monks. The cave is nestled against the foot of Mount Kanthan in the Kinta Valley. It looks like a spiritual retreat straight out of an ancient Southeast Asian storybook. A total of 15 monks live inside the monastery, but they might not be there for too much longer. In the 1960s, the local government leased the sacred mountain to a cement company for quarrying. Although the fairytale mountain home of the monks was left untouched, the quarry was built close enough to ruin the peace and quiet. The dynamite explosions needed to extract the limestone shakes the very foundations of their home and can be heard echoing through the valley like gunfire. It's a real shame because the Buddhist sanctuary was built over a century ago, with monks originally drawn to the area because the mountain resembles a reclining Buddha. The monastery was once a peaceful place, with the only sound being the drip of water from stalactites on the cave ceiling. Monks even use this water to bathe themselves. However, the peaceful mountain monastery is on the brink of destruction because of the limestone mine. Hauska Castle. In the Czech Republic, there is a mysterious fortress that supposedly hides a gateway to hell. It's a Gothic structure perched on the edge of a cliff that looks kind of like an abandoned insane asylum from the outside. It's north of Prague, located in the Liberec region in the municipality of Blace. According to local legend, Hauska Castle was once a source of demonic monsters that plagued local farmers. It was built between 1253 and 1278 in the absolute middle of nowhere. Prague was significantly smaller 8 centuries ago, and the hills where the castle stands today were once isolated. The castle was constructed far away from trading routes in a darkly forested region, similar to Transylvania. King Ottokar II of Bohemia used the castle as his administrative center during his reign between 1253 and 1278. But what about the alleged portal to hell? There is supposedly a crack in the limestone foundation of the castle that leads to a bottomless pit. Legends throughout the Middle Ages spoke of demonic creatures crawling out from the pit and terrorizing the countryside. We don't know if there's any truth to this, especially since Eastern Europeans were especially paranoid in the Middle Ages, scared of everything from vampires to werewolves. What we do know is that a chapel dedicated to Archangel Michael was allegedly built over the crack in the ground, thereby preventing more demons from escaping hell. The Catacombs of Kom el Shokafa. The Catacombs of Kom el Shokafa is one of the most intense places in all of Egypt. It's not nearly as popular as the pyramids or the temples at Luxor, and yet it was considered to be one of the 7 wonders of the Middle Ages. A visit here will almost certainly be spent alone, perusing the dark and deep passages of a haunted necropolis on the outskirts of the ancient city of Alexandria. The unassuming entrance to the catacombs looks like nothing more than a well, but there is a spiral staircase which leads down into the dark, where a pharaonic funerary cult once participated in creepy rituals. The tombs are a mixture of Greek, Roman, and Egyptian architectural styles. Construction likely began in the early 2nd century AD, and these tunnels were used until the 4th century AD when it was suddenly abandoned. It wasn't discovered again until the year 1900, when a donkey broke through the access shaft by accident. The Catacombs of Kom el Shokafa are straight out of a medieval fairy tale. It's one of the only truly creepy underground catacombs in the world, with partially flooded chambers and cracked tombs where the dead had lain undisturbed for almost 2,000 years. Warwick Castle. Warwick Castle is one of the greatest military castles in all of England. It's exactly what you expect a fairy tale castle to look like, with its tall towers and white-gray defensive walls. It's sitting in the town of Warwick at the edge of a sandstone bluff, originally constructed by William the Conqueror in 1068 AD. It was later rebuilt in the 12th century, but its architecture is still largely original. It was used all the way until the 17th century when it was converted into a country house. It didn't become a tourist attraction until around 1978, when it was purchased by the Tussauds Group, who also happened to own the Madame Tussauds wax museums. Warwick Castle played a major role in British history. Before it was even built, there was an Anglo-Saxon fort sitting on the site constructed by Ethelfled in 914 AD. She was the daughter of legendary King Alfred the Great, and she built the fort to defend the Saxons against Danish invaders. William the Conqueror later turned the wooden fortification into a stone castle. At least he started the process. The stone castle wouldn't be completed until about 2 centuries after his death in the 13th century. Warwick Castle was used in 1469 to keep Edward IV prisoner. King Richard III took over the castle in the 1480s, and in 1642, the castle even participated in the English Civil War as a stronghold against the Royalists. Nia. It may seem hard to believe, but there was once an ancient network of roads going all the way from the edges of the Mediterranean to the farthest reaches of Asia and Africa. Before the invention of cars, goods moved in caravans. Hundreds of merchants used the vast road network to bring exotic goods from places like India and China all the way to the Roman Empire. Some of the most valuable goods transported were silk, which is how the trade network earned its name, the Silk Road. One of these ancient roads led directly to the far-flung city of Nia. It was an impressive center for commerce in an isolated oasis way out in the Taklamakan Desert. Even these days, with airplanes and cars, it's not an easy place to get to. The city of Nia dates back to at least 206 BC. prospered until around 23 AD, and then gradually started to be covered by the shifting sands of the desert. Judging on what archaeologists have found in the destroyed city, its residents left in a hurry. When scholars began investigating in recent years, they found evidence that dogs were left tied up in front of people's houses. Something happened in the remote oasis town that caused its residents to abandon their meals, leave their pets, and flee into the desert. Scientists have never been able to understand what caused the sudden desertion. 2,000 years ago, the city was abandoned in a matter of minutes, then lost until rediscovered by Sir Mark Arlstein in 1901. Firozko and the Turquoise Mountain. The Ghurid Empire was one of the most powerful groups of people to rule over the lands of Persia. And yet, despite their prestige, not very many people have heard of them. They ruled a massive part of the mountains and plains in northern Afghanistan and all the way through northern India. They were only around for about 200 years, but they still made an impact. Between the 10th century and their dramatic end in 1215, they were the mountain overlords of Ghor. They also built one of the greatest cities Afghanistan has ever seen, Firozko. It's no exaggeration. Scholars really have referred to Firozko as one of the greatest cities ever constructed. Its name translates from Persian to mean turquoise mountain. As far as the ancient historical records show, it was a vast summer capital where people flocked to in the hot months to participate in celebration and trade. The city was incredibly wealthy. It was ripe with architectural splendors, and yet nobody has ever seen them before. The city of Firozko is lost. Location unknown. We know it was somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan. Researchers just don't know exactly where it is. The whole city was destroyed by Genghis Khan's son, Tolui, in 1223. The empire had poured a large amount of their resources into the creation of the city, only to have it torn down and lost forever. Usakli Hoyuk. The Hittites were the dominant civilization in ancient Anatolia around 1700 BC. They were spread across the northern Levant all the way into Upper Mesopotamia, thriving and surviving up until around 1190 BC. When the empire collapsed, they split into small factions and tribes, but they never made a grand comeback. What we know about the Hittite people comes largely from ancient cuneiform texts written in the Akkadian language. Many of these texts include diplomatic correspondence between the Hittites in Anatolia and their counterparts in Assyria, Babylonia, and Egypt. In one of these texts is described a mythical city called Zibalanda. The tablet describes it as a cult center of religious activity, with worshippers primarily revering the storm god Ziblantil. The city was supposedly a place of great celebration, holding annual festivals and mysterious rituals. However, nobody has ever found it. At least nobody knew they had found it until just recently. Archaeologists working with the University of Pisa were excavating the site of Usakli Hoyuk when they realized they were combing through the ruins of a lost city. The site of Usakli Hoyuk is an ancient mound, a vague pile of dirt with secrets hidden underneath. Researchers always knew the mound was important, but it was only now that they found the remains of structures buried underground. They uncovered a temple, a fortress, and other artifacts that point to the location once being a city. Professor D'Agostino says it could be the city of Zibalanda, the cult center of the Hittite storm god. It's shout-out time! I want to say a big thank you to Mr. Unlucky and Ed's Cover PH for supporting this channel. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos like these. Harappa. In the province of Punjab in Pakistan lies the ancient village of Harappa, directly next to the modern town of the same name. But the ancient part of this city is truly old and represents some of the greatest achievements of the Indus Valley civilization. The city was discovered in 1826 by James Lewis, a deserter from the British Army. After he ditched the army, he became an explorer and went searching for evidence of lost civilizations. When he came upon the remnants of Harappa, he believed they were from the age of Alexander, 1,300 years earlier. Over the next few years, the city was gradually picked apart by locals working on a new railroad who wanted cheap supplies. It was easier for them to disassemble the stone blocks of the ancient buildings than carve new ones. It wouldn't be until even later that archaeologists realized the site was much older than the days of Alexander the Great. The city of Harappa likely began 6,000 years ago or more. Harappa was one of the gateway towns leading to the interior of the Indus Valley civilization. It had massive defensive walls, the people here were skilled artisans, and they had all the same districts you would expect to find in an ancient city. There were residential districts, open markets, industrial zones, and large public spaces. They used mud for mortar, built their houses out of burnt bricks, and survived thanks to the freshwater supply of the nearby river. It was only when the river dried up that Harappa started to die. The Sindhja Valley. In the Sindhja Valley of Nepal, archaeologists with Cambridge University revealed the remains of a lost ancient settlement. They uncovered crumbling palaces, shattered temples, and even a network of underground pipes used to bring water straight into people's homes. Old monoliths were found here, built from huge stone columns, just like Stonehenge. It wasn't long before researchers realized they were dealing with a megalithic city, which was likely the capital of the mysterious Khasa Kingdom. The Khasa Kingdom of Nepal has a lot of parallels to the Ghurid Empire of Afghanistan. Both kingdoms only ruled for about 200 years, and both their mighty capitals were lost. The major difference is that the Khasa Kingdom came into power right around the time the Ghurid Empire was defeated by the Mongols in the early 1200s. The Khasa were an interesting group of people whose origins may have been ancient. Inscriptions from some of the earliest Indian texts, like the Mahabharata, mention the Khasa tribes. These were an ancient people who lived in the passes of Tibet, the valleys of Nepal, and the mountains of India. Nobody knows how old they are, or if they were the descendants of the Indus Valley people. Whatever the case may be, the Khasa became a kingdom to be reckoned with in the 11th century and took over the Sindhja Valley. But by 1413 AD, they had not expanded enough. The last king perished and the kingdom disintegrated, and their capital in the Sindhja Valley was lost. The lost site of the Maya. Geologists working in northern Guatemala have just discovered more lost cities than they know what to do with. They used lasers beamed out of airplanes to create an incredibly detailed map of the Guatemalan jungle. The lasers revealed over 650 square miles of abandoned settlements and cities once occupied by the Maya civilization. This was once a bustling hub of activity, with people traveling along interconnected highways by foot and through canals using narrow boats. There are over 1,000 settlements lost to the jungle here, most of them nothing more than a few crumbling stone buildings. And yet there were also pyramids, temple complexes, and huge reservoirs used for water storage. One of the authors of the study, Carlos Morales Aguilar, says the lasers showed evidence for the first time in history of an integrated Maya society. What this means is that they didn't just find a single lost city, but rather they uncovered a connected civilization. It was like uncovering an entire province, with small settlements connected to larger towns, all leading to industrial cities and religious centers. To put things simply, the lasers revealed the entire lost landscape of the Maya region in the northern Guatemalan jungle. But just what exactly were the Maya doing here? Scientists say the Maya settled in the region because it was a kind of Goldilocks zone for development. It had enough high land to build settlements, with enough marshy lowlands for agriculture. There's also a large source of limestone in the area to help build their pyramids and homes. The Atlantis of Egypt. Egypt has its very own sunken city, and it can be found underneath the waters off the coast of Alexandria. Heraklion, Egypt's own Atlantis, is currently one of the most marvelous underwater archaeological discoveries ever made. It was an ancient trading port built on a pair of islands in the Nile Delta. It had its own harbors, canals, temples, and great houses linked by bridges and pontoons. Picture Venice in Italy with its narrow canals navigated by ferries, only in ancient Egypt. Heraklion likely got its start in the 12th century BC, over 800 years before the city of Alexandria was founded. For decades, archaeologists weren't even fully convinced the city existed. They had read inscriptions of it, seen the name of the city mentioned in ancient texts, but never imagined it was really waiting off the coast to be discovered. In 1933, a Royal Air Force commander flew over the bay and saw the ruins of something in the water. But it wouldn't be until 1999 that famous French archaeologist Frank Gaudio's team dove into the depths and began uncovering history. They excavated statues of gods, the faces of kings and queens, broken temples, and so much more. We now know Heraklion sank because the soil it was built on liquefied. At the end of the 2nd century BC, the whole city started to drift into the sea until it was submerged under 30 feet of water. The lost city of the Lulubi. A team of French archaeologists recently discovered an ancient lost city near the Zagros Mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan. Scientists are saying the city once stood as a strategic gateway into the first great empire of Mesopotamia. That would be the Akkadian Empire, which rose to prominence 5,000 years ago. The city was likely the capital of the Lulubi, described in ancient Mesopotamian scripture as mountain barbarians. They were not technically part of Akkad, but a separate group controlling the mountains near Baghdad. To reach Akkad from the north, the only way was to move through the territory of the Lulubi. They had their own king, King Anubanini, who ruled around 2300 BC. They were literate in both Akkadian and Sumerian writing. They supported a large population using extensive agricultural systems, and they had the same technology as the rest of the people in Mesopotamia. But of course, they were overshadowed by the Akkadians to the south. What a lot of people don't realize is that Mesopotamia was not a single civilization, but rather a region. Mesopotamia was home to a lot of different people. The Lulubi, the Awan, the Kimash, the Shimashki, the Sherihun, etc. Most of these people have been erased from history, their cities destroyed, and their cultures lost. Just discovering the 4,000-year-old Lulubi city is nothing short of a miracle, though even still we know very little about them. Quentovik. Quentovik was a Frankish trading town in the early Middle Ages near the English Channel. It was founded in the early 6th century by an unknown king of Neustria, one of the western kingdoms of the Franks. It was here where Anglo-Saxon monks arrived from England to begin their long pilgrimages to Rome. But to be entirely honest, the history of the town is a little hard to understand since it no longer exists. The only historical evidence of Quentovik comes in the form of coins and taxation records. Most historians agree the town was established as a way to increase long-distance trade. It was also wise to have a town directly on the English Channel to help defend the borders of the kingdom. In the 1980s, archaeologist David Hill uncovered the physical location of Quentovik, but much to the disappointment of the experts, nothing remained. We know where the city was, but there isn't a single piece of it left. The town was raided by Vikings in 842, only surviving because they paid a massive tribute to their attackers. But then, in the 10th century, merchants started to leave as bigger and better ports were being built in England. Eventually, the whole city just kind of evaporated. Archaeologists are still a little baffled as to how the entire town just one day ceased to exist. Niani. The small village of Niani can be found in Guinea, many miles inland from the Atlantic Ocean in West Africa. The town is currently still occupied, sitting right at the edge of the forest in a region once rich with gold, palm oil, and ivory. But the true history of Niani is largely lost. Many scholars believe it was once the capital of the powerful Mali Empire. This was a kingdom that ruled a large chunk of West Africa from between 1226 to 1670. It was one of the most prosperous African kingdoms of the Middle Ages, and at its peak, the largest in West Africa. However, we don't have as many records of African history as we do of European history during that time, so there is little reliable information on the once proud cities of the Mali Empire. Niani is mentioned briefly in the writings of a 16th century traveler named Leo Africanus, and also by the 14th century historian Shihab al-Umari, who said Niani was the capital of the entire empire. It was a main hub for trade, bustling with over 100,000 inhabitants, and lorded over by powerful emperors. Niani likely controlled all trade routes going north and south, and was the garrison of the imperial army. In the 1600s, the African empire began to decline, and Niani lost its importance. It shrank, people left, and it went from a shining city to a poor village. Archaeologists first found evidence of an ancient city in the 1920s, but almost nothing was left. These days, there's barely even a single stone house to prove a mighty capital once stood here. Thanks for watching! If you could find just one undiscovered lost city, which one would you choose? Let us know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. See you next time. Bye!